Richard Sterling adjusted his silk tie as his limousine glided through the morning traffic of downtown Chicago. At 52, he had built Velocity Innovations from a small startup in his garage to a technology empire worth $3 billion. Today would mark the pinnacle of his career, a merger with Titanium Systems. That would create the largest tech conglomerate in the Midwest. His fingers drummed against the leather seat as he reviewed the presentation on his tablet one final time. Every detail had been meticulously planned over the past 18 months. The Grand Continental Hotel rose before him like a monument of glass and steel. Victor Hartwell, his CFO and best friend since college, had chosen this venue for the board meeting. Richard smiled, remembering how they had started their journey together in a cramped dormitory room, sketching business plans on napkins. 27 years later, they were about to achieve something extraordinary. His phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Everything is set. This is our moment, partner. See you in conference room A." Richard stepped out of the limousine, his Italian shoes clicking against the marble entrance. The hotel lobby bustled with business travelers and tourists, but his mind remained focused on the contracts awaiting his signature upstairs. He had barely taken 10 steps toward the elevator when a young woman suddenly stepped into his path. An interruption that changed everything, Mr. Sterling. "Please, you cannot go to that meeting." "What?" Richard blinked, taken aback by the interruption. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s, dressed in the hotel's standard black and white uniform with a name tag that read Claire Bennett, event coordinator. Her brown hair was pulled back in a professional bun, but several strands had come loose, giving her a disheveled appearance. What struck him most were her eyes wide, urgent, and filled with genuine fear. "Excuse me?" Richard's tone was polite but firm. He had no time for whatever this was about. "I have an important meeting to attend." Claire glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "I know this sounds insane, Mr. Sterling, but I need you to listen to me. Something terrible is going to happen in that conference room today. You are walking into a trap." Richard felt a flash of irritation. Security at the Grand Continental was supposed to be excellent. How had this woman gotten close enough to accost him? He started to move past her, but Claire reached out, her hand stopping just short of touching his arm. "Please," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "Your business partner, Victor Hartwell, he's not who you think he is. The merger, the board meeting, it's all a setup. If you go up there, you will lose everything. Your company, your reputation, possibly even your freedom." The seed of doubt Richard froze. The mention of Victor's name had caught his attention, despite his better judgment. He studied Claire's face more carefully. She was not displaying the typical signs of mental instability or malicious intent. Instead, she appeared genuinely terrified, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a manila folder to her chest. "How do you know Victor's name?" Richard asked, his voice cautious. "And why would you make such serious accusations against him?" Claire took a deep breath, seeming to gather her courage. "2 nights ago, I was preparing conference room A for today's meeting. I was arranging the chairs when I heard voices in the adjacent room. The walls here are thinner than they should be. I heard Victor Hartwell speaking with 2 other men. They were discussing how they planned to present evidence during the meeting that would make it appear that you have been embezzling millions from Velocity Innovations." Richard's jaw tightened. "That is absurd." "I would never—" "I know you didn't do it," Claire interrupted. "But Victor has been creating a paper trail for years. Forged signatures, falsified transactions, shell companies registered under variations of your name. He has everything ready. The moment you sign those merger documents, he will activate the trap. The board will turn on you, the police will be called, and by the end of the day, you will be facing criminal charges while Victor completes the merger and takes control of everything."
Oh.
The lobby seemed to tilt around Richard. His first instinct was to dismiss this as elaborate nonsense. Perhaps even a competitor's desperate attempt to disrupt the merger. Yet something in Claire's demeanor gave him pause. She was not asking for money or making demands. She was simply trying to warn him at obvious personal risk. Why would Victor do this? Richard heard himself ask. "We built this company together. We've been friends for nearly 3 decades. Claire's expression softened with something like pity. I don't know all his reasons, Mr. Sterling, but I do know that people change. Sometimes the person we trust most is the one who's been planning our downfall all along. A choice to make. Richard's phone buzzed again. Another text from Victor. Where are you? The board is assembled and waiting. Don't keep them waiting, old friend. He looked at the message, then back at Claire. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to ignore this woman and proceed with the meeting as planned. He had lawyers, accountants, and trusted advisors who had reviewed every aspect of the merger. If Victor was truly planning something sinister, surely someone would have noticed. But there was one thing that gave Richard pause, a memory from 3 weeks ago. He had stopped by the office late one evening to retrieve some documents and had been surprised to find Victor still there, hunched over his computer. When Richard entered, Victor had quickly closed several windows on his screen, his face flushing red. At the time, Richard had assumed his friend was working on a surprise for the merger celebration. Now, he wondered what Victor had really been doing. What evidence do you have? Richard asked Claire, gesturing to the folder she held. Claire opened it, revealing several printed emails and financial documents. These are copies of communications between Victor and a man named Gerald Stratton from Titanium Systems. They discuss the timeline for exposing your supposed embezzlement, how to handle the board's reaction, and how to divide your shares once you are removed. I found these in the recycling bin outside Conference Room A yesterday. Someone printed them, but must have decided they were too risky to keep. Richard took the folder, his hands suddenly feeling cold despite the warm lobby. He scanned the documents, his trained eye picking out details that made his stomach clench. The emails referenced account numbers at offshore banks, specific board members who had been convinced of Richard's guilt, and a contingency plan if Richard tried to deny the accusations. The signature at the bottom of each email was unmistakable, Victor's elaborate scrawl that Richard had seen thousands of times over the years. Mr. Sterling, Claire said softly, I know this is overwhelming, but you need to make a decision right now. Either go up to that meeting and hope I am wrong, or take a moment to verify what I am telling you before you sign away your life's work. Richard looked toward the elevators, then back at the woman who had just turned his world upside down. His phone buzzed a third time, but he did not look at it. Instead, he made a choice that would alter the course of his life. Conference Room A is on the 15th floor, he asked. Claire nodded. Yes, sir. Then let's go somewhere we can talk properly. I need to understand exactly what you heard and how you came to have these documents. If what you are saying is true, I need more than just suspicions before I accuse my oldest friend of betrayal. Relief washed over Claire's face. Thank you for listening. I have a small office on the 3rd floor where we can speak privately. I also have something else to show you, something about my connection to all of this. As Richard followed Claire toward the service elevator, his mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? Why had she taken such a risk to warn him? And most importantly, was it possible that Victor, his friend, his partner, the man who had stood beside him through every triumph and setback, had been plotting against him all along? The elevator doors closed, sealing Richard away from the meeting that was supposed to define his legacy. In that moment, suspended between floors, he realized that sometimes the most important decisions are made not in boardrooms with expensive lawyers, but in hotel lobbies with strangers who care enough to tell the truth. The service elevator descended with a mechanical hum that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Richard watched the floor numbers tick downward, his mind spinning with possibilities he had never considered. Claire stood beside him, clutching the manila folder like a lifeline, her eyes fixed on the elevator doors as if willing them to open faster. When they reached the 3rd floor, Claire led him through a maze of narrow corridors that hotel guests never saw. The polished marble and elegant chandeliers of the main areas gave way to simple white walls and fluorescent lighting. They passed laundry carts, supply closets, and exhausted-looking staff members, who barely glanced up as they hurried past. Claire's office turned out to be barely larger than a closet, wedged between the housekeeping supply room and a mechanical space filled with the rumble of air conditioning units. A small desk held a computer monitor, several file folders, and a framed photograph that Richard could not quite see from the doorway. She gestured for him to enter, then closed the door behind them. "I apologize for the cramped space," Claire said, her voice steadier now that they were away from prying eyes. "The hotel does not exactly prioritize office space for event coordinators." Richard waved away her apology, his attention already focused on the walls. He had expected typical office decorations, but instead found himself looking at what could only be described as an investigation board. Photographs, printed articles, handwritten notes, and timeline charts covered nearly every inch of available wall space. Red string connected various pieces of information, creating a web of connections that made Richard's chest tighten. At the center of it all was a photograph of Victor Hartwell. A personal mission revealed. "How long have you been planning this?" Richard asked, his voice carefully neutral. Part of him wondered if he had made a terrible mistake following this woman to an isolated location. Claire moved to stand beside the wall, her fingers tracing one of the red strings. 6 months of working at this hotel, but the real answer is 5 years. That is how long I have been trying to find proof of what Victor Hartwell did to my father. She reached for the framed photograph on her desk and handed it to Richard. It showed a younger Claire, perhaps in her early 20s, standing beside a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair. They were both smiling, caught in a moment of genuine happiness that made Richard's throat tighten. "This is Nathan Bennett," Claire continued, her voice thick with emotion. "My father, he was Victor's personal accountant for 12 years. He was brilliant with numbers, meticulous in his record-keeping, and completely devoted to doing honest work. Those qualities ended up killing him." Richard sank into the single chair in the small office, the photograph still in his hands. "I remember Nathan. Victor mentioned him several times over the years. He said Nathan retired and moved to Arizona for health reasons." Claire's laugh was bitter. That was the story Victor wanted everyone to believe. The truth is far darker. 5 years ago, my father discovered irregularities in Velocity Innovations accounts. Money was disappearing in small amounts, never enough to trigger immediate alarm, but over time it added up to millions. My father spent weeks tracking the transactions, following the digital trail through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. When he finally pieced it together, he realized that Victor had been systematically embezzling from your company for over a decade. The accountant who knew too much, Richard, felt his hands beginning to shake. If Nathan discovered this, why didn't he come to me? Why didn't he report Victor to the authorities? "He tried," Claire said, pulling out another folder from her desk drawer. "These are copies of emails my father sent to you 5 years ago. 3 separate attempts to reach you directly and explain what he had found. But Victor intercepted them all. He had access to your email accounts, claimed it was necessary for efficiency. My father never realized that his warnings never reached you." She spread the emails across the desk. Richard recognized his own email address at the top of each one, but he had never seen these messages. The dates corresponded to a period when he had been traveling extensively in Asia, finalizing contracts for Velocity Innovations' expansion into new markets. Victor had been handling communications in his absence. When my father realized his emails were being blocked, he arranged a meeting with you, Claire continued. He called your office repeatedly, finally managing to schedule an appointment for a Monday morning. He was going to bring all his evidence, lay everything out for you personally. That meeting was supposed to happen on November 18th, 5 years ago. Richard's mind raced back to that date. He remembered it clearly because it was the day after he had received devastating news. That was the day after Nathan died. "Victor told me it was a heart attack." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. Yes. My father was found dead in his home office on Sunday evening, surrounded by his financial records. The police investigation was Minamula, 53-year-old man with high blood pressure and stress. Working late on a Sunday night, it seemed like a tragic but natural death." She pulled out yet another document, this one a toxicology report. "But I never believed it. My father was careful about his health. He exercised regularly, took his medication religiously, and had just passed a complete physical examination 2 weeks before his death. So I paid for an independent autopsy, an additional toxicology screening. It took me 3 years to save enough money, and by then the results were not conclusive enough for the police to reopen the case. But they showed traces of a substance that can trigger heart attacks in people with pre-existing conditions. Substance that would have been nearly undetectable in a standard autopsy. Following the money trail, Richard stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the chair. The small office suddenly felt impossibly confining. Are you telling me that Victor murdered your father? I cannot prove it in a court of law, Claire admitted. Not yet. But I know in my heart that Victor realized my father was about to expose him. And I know that my father's death was far too convenient for Victor's timeline. Within 2 months of my father's passing, Victor had hired a new accountant, one who was much less thorough and asked far fewer questions. Richard pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to process the avalanche of information. The man he had trusted for 27 years, the friend who had been best man at his wedding, the partner who had celebrated every success and mourned every setback alongside him. Could that man truly be capable of embezzlement and murder? Show me the financial evidence, Richard said finally. If what you are saying is true, there must be a clear trail. Victor is brilliant, but no one can hide that much money without leaving traces. Claire's expression brightened slightly. I was hoping you would say that. I am not an accountant like my father, but I spent the past 5 years learning everything I could about financial forensics. I knew that if I was going to honor my father's memory and stop Victor, I needed to understand the system he was exploiting. She turned to her computer and pulled up a series of spreadsheets and documents. Victor's scheme was sophisticated, but not impossible to trace once you know what to look for. He created a network of shell companies, each one seemingly legitimate on the surface. Some of them even do real business, providing services to Velocity Innovations at slightly inflated prices. The markup is never large enough to raise red flags, but over time it accumulates. Richard leaned over her shoulder, his trained eye scanning the numbers. He recognized some of the company names vendors that Velocity Innovations had used for years. Others were unfamiliar, but the patterns Claire highlighted were damning. Payments for consulting services that were never rendered. Equipment purchases that were never delivered. Licensing fees for software that did not exist. The merger makes sense. This is extensive. Richard muttered, his stomach churning. If these numbers are accurate, Victor has stolen close to $40 million over the past 15 years. 43 million, by my calculations, Claire corrected. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. Victor knows that eventually someone might notice these discrepancies. So he has been preparing a backup plan, making it appear that you are the one who created these shell companies and siphoned off the money. She pulled up another set of documents. These ones showing incorporation papers for several of the shell companies. Richard's breath caught when he saw the signatures his own name, rendered in what appeared to be his handwriting. These are forgeries, he said immediately. I never signed these documents. I know, Claire said, but they are excellent forgeries. Victor has had access to your signature on thousands of documents over the years. He could easily have practiced replicating it. And look at the incorporation dates, they are spread out over years, making it seem like this has been a long-term operation on your part. Richard sank back into the chair, the full picture finally coming into focus. The merger with Titanium Systems. Victor has been pushing for it for over a year, insisting that it was the natural next step for the company. I thought he was being ambitious, thinking about our legacy. He was thinking about his exit strategy, Claire said. Once the merger is complete, and you are removed from the company under suspicion of embezzlement, Victor will have positioned himself as the savior who kept Velocity Innovations stable during the crisis. Titanium Systems will complete the acquisition, Victor will walk away with a massive payout, and all evidence of his crimes will be buried in the corporate restructuring. A race against time. Richard's phone had been buzzing continuously in his pocket. He finally pulled it out and saw a dozen missed calls and texts from Victor, each one increasingly urgent and irritated. The most recent message read, Richard, where are you? The board is getting restless. This is unprofessional. Call me immediately. He is panicking, Claire observed. Everything was supposed to go according to his script. Your absence is disrupting his carefully laid plans. Richard made a decision. I need to make a call. Someone I trust completely. Someone who has been with Velocity Innovations since the beginning, but operates independently from Victor's influence. He dialed a number he knew by heart. After 3 rings, a woman's voice answered. Sterling residence. Margaret, it is Richard. I need you to do something for me right away, and I need you to not tell anyone about this call, especially not Victor. Margaret Patterson had been Richard's executive assistant for 18 years before retiring last year. She knew every aspect of Velocity, innovations, operations, and had always maintained her own meticulous records, much to Victor's occasional annoyance. What is going on, Richard? Margaret's voice immediately shifted from friendly to concerned. Victor called me 20 minutes ago asking if I had heard from you. He sounded stressed. Margaret, I need you to access the backup files you kept when you retired. The ones Victor insisted were unnecessary, but you maintained anyway. I need you to pull every financial record, every vendor contract, and every approval form from the past 15 years. Focus especially on the companies Claire Bennett's father Nathan flagged in his final weeks with us. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Nathan Bennett. Richard, why are you asking about him now? He passed away years ago, I know, and I am beginning to suspect his death was not as natural as we were told. Margaret, I would not ask this if it were not critical. Can you access those files? Give me 30 minutes, Margaret said without hesitation. I will pull everything and meet you wherever you need me. Richard looked at Claire. Where can we go that is secure? Somewhere with internet access and enough space to spread out documents? Claire thought for a moment. There is a business center on the 2nd floor that is rarely used during weekday mornings. It has computers, printers, and a conference table. I can lock the door from the inside. Perfect. Margaret, meet us at the Grand Continental Hotel, 2nd floor business center in 30 minutes. As Richard ended the call, his phone immediately rang again. Victor's name flashed on the screen. This time Richard answered, Where the hell are you? Victor's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. The board is threatening to walk out. We are about to lose this merger because you decided to disappear. Richard kept his voice calm. I had an emergency come up. A potential issue with some old vendor contracts that could affect the merger. I am reviewing the details now, before we proceed. There was a pause. When Victor spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, a note of wariness creeping in. What vendor contracts? Richard, whatever this is, it can wait until after the meeting. We have lawyers who can handle any contractual issues. I would rather be cautious. Give me an hour, Victor. Tell the board I am conducting due diligence. They will understand. An hour, Victor repeated. Fine, but Richard, do not make this difficult. We have worked too hard for too long to let anything derail this now. The call ended, and Richard looked at Claire. He is suspicious. We need to move fast. Once Victor realizes what we are investigating, he will start destroying evidence. The investigation begins 20 minutes later. Richard and Claire were locked in the business center, transforming the small conference table into a makeshift investigation hub. Claire had brought down all her research from her office, while Richard used the business center's computers to access Velocity Innovations' cloud-based financial systems. When Margaret arrived, slightly out of breath and carrying a large storage box, the pieces began to fall into place with frightening clarity. The 3 of them worked in intense silence, occasionally calling out discoveries or asking questions, but mostly focused on building an irrefutable case. Here, Margaret said, pointing to a series of transactions from 8 years ago. These payments to Apex Consulting Group, I remember questioning these at the time, because we had never used that company before. Victor told me you had personally approved them during a trip to Germany. Richard shook his head. I was in Germany negotiating the Schneider deal, but I never approved any payments to Apex Consulting. Let me see the approval forms. Margaret pulled them from the box. Richard's signature was there, but as he studied it closely, he could see subtle differences in the pen pressure and letter formation. It was an excellent forgery, but not perfect. Apex Consulting is one of the shell companies, Claire confirmed, checking her list. It received over $2 million in payments over a 3-year period before being dissolved. The company was registered in Delaware under your name, Mr. Sterling. The pattern repeated across dozens of companies and hundreds of transactions, each one carefully crafted to appear legitimate on the surface, but underneath revealing a systematic theft that had been occurring for over a decade as they worked. Richard felt his shock giving way to cold fury. Victor had not just stolen money. He had stolen years of trust, had corrupted the company Richard loved, and if Claire's suspicions were correct, had murdered a good man who had simply tried to do the right thing. "We have enough," Margaret finally said, looking at the mountain of evidence they had compiled. "This is enough to not only stop the merger but to send Victor to prison for a very long time." Richard checked his watch. 53 minutes had passed since his call with Victor. He pulled out his phone and dialed a new number. "Detective Morrison. This is Richard Sterling. We met last year at the mayor's charity gala. I need your help with something urgent. How quickly can you get to the Grand Continental Hotel?" Detective James Morrison arrived at the Grand Continental Hotel with remarkable speed, accompanied by 2 other plainclothes officers and a representative from the Financial Crimes Division. Richard had worked with Morrison on a charity initiative previous year and had been impressed by the detective's sharp mind and unwavering integrity. Now, as Morrison examined the evidence spread across the business center table, his expression grew increasingly grave. "This is substantial," Morrison said, photographing each document methodically. "Mr. Sterling, you understand that what you are alleging here is extremely serious. If we move forward with this, there will be no going back. Your company will be under intense scrutiny, your business partner will face criminal charges, and the media attention will be overwhelming." Richard met the detective's gaze without flinching. "I understand completely. But if I do nothing, an innocent man's death goes unanswered. My company continues to be looted, and a criminal walks away with everything he has stolen. That is not acceptable to me." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then we need to be strategic about how we handle this. Your business partner is currently in a conference room with your board of directors, correct?" "Conference room A on the 15th floor?" Claire confirmed. "The meeting was scheduled to start an hour ago, but they have been waiting for Mr. Sterling." "Good. That gives us an advantage. Mr. Sterling, I need you to go to that meeting as if nothing has changed. Proceed with the merger discussion. Let Victor believe everything is going according to his plan. Meanwhile, my team will be obtaining warrants and preparing to make arrests. The moment Victor attempts to present his fabricated evidence against you, we will intervene." Richard felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "You want me to walk into that room knowing what I know and pretend everything is fine?" "I need you to give us time to do this properly," Morrison said. "If we move too quickly, Victor might have contingencies we don't know about. He could destroy evidence, flee, or activate backup plans. But if he believes he is winning, he will make mistakes. Criminals always do when they think they are untouchable." Margaret placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "You can do this. You have faced down hostile investors, aggressive competitors, and corporate raiders. This is just another negotiation, except this time, you hold all the cards, even if Victor does not know it yet." Claire stepped forward, her expression determined. "I want to be there too. In the room, I mean. I've waited 5 years for this moment. I need to see Victor's face when he realizes everything has fallen apart." Morrison shook his head. "That could be dangerous, Miss Bennett. We do not know how Victor will react when cornered." "Then have your officers nearby," Claire insisted. "But I deserve to be there. My father deserves to have someone present who knows the truth about what happened to him." Richard looked at the young woman who had risked everything to warn him. In the span of a few hours, Claire had gone from a stranger to someone Richard deeply respected. If Claire wants to be there, I want her there too. She can pose as my new assistant. It will give Victor something to puzzle over, keep him slightly off balance. Morrison considered this for a moment before nodding. "Fine. But you follow my instructions exactly. Both of you will be wearing listening devices. The moment I sense the situation is becoming dangerous, you both leave the room immediately. Understood?" Entering the Lion's Den 20 minutes later, Richard stepped off the elevator onto the 15th floor with Claire beside him. She had changed into a professional suit that Margaret had quickly procured from a nearby department store, and she carried a leather portfolio that contained recording devices and a panic button. Richard's own jacket concealed similar equipment. As they approached conference room A, Richard could hear raised voices inside. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath to center himself. Claire caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. Richard pushed open the door. The conference room fell silent as he entered. 8 board members sat around the large mahogany table, their expressions ranging from irritation to concern. At the head of the table, Victor stood with his arms crossed, his face flushed red with anger that quickly shifted to surprise when he saw Claire. "Richard," Victor said, his voice strained with false warmth. "Finally. We were beginning to think something terrible had happened to you." "And who is this?" "This is Claire Bennett, my new executive assistant," Richard said smoothly, gesturing for Claire to take a seat along the wall. "She has been helping me review some important documents this morning. I apologize for the delay, everyone. Please, let us begin." Richard noticed the flicker of confusion that crossed Victor's face at the mention of Claire's last name, but his partner quickly masked it. The board members settled back into their seats, clearly eager to move past the awkward delay. "Before we proceed with the merger discussion," Victor said, his voice regaining some of its usual confidence, "there is an urgent matter we need to address. Richard, I have recently become aware of some financial irregularities that require immediate attention." "It comes," Richard thought. He forced his expression to remain neutral and curious. "What kind of irregularities?" Victor opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Over the past several weeks, I have been conducting a routine audit in preparation for the merger. What I discovered disturbed me greatly, Richard. It appears that there have been unauthorized transactions, payments to shell companies, and diversion of funds that go back over a decade." The board members leaned forward, their interest clearly piqued. Victor continued, his voice taking on a tone of reluctant sorrow. "I did not want to believe it at first. We have been partners for so long, friends even longer, but the evidence is undeniable. Richard, these shell companies are registered in your name. These transactions bear your signature. I need you to explain what has been happening with Velocity Innovations' finances." Richard allowed a moment of silence to stretch out, watching Victor's performance with detached fascination. His former friend was good. The concern in his voice sounded genuine.
Oh.
The reluctance to make such accusations appeared authentic. If Richard had not spent the morning uncovering the truth, he might have been fooled himself. "The tables turn. That is a very serious accusation, Victor," Richard said calmly. "You are suggesting that I have been embezzling from my own company." "I am not suggesting anything," Victor replied, spreading documents across the table. "I am presenting facts. These incorporation papers show shell companies registered under your name. These bank records show money flowing from Velocity Innovations into accounts you control. These approval forms bear your signature authorizing payments for services that were never rendered." Board member Patricia Nguyen picked up one of the documents, her face pale. "Richard, is this true? Have you been stealing from the company?" Before Richard could answer, Victor pressed his advantage. "I've already contacted our legal team and financial auditors. They are prepared to conduct a full investigation. Richard, I think it would be best if you stepped down temporarily as CEO while we sort through this mess. For the good of the company and the merger." "The merger," Richard repeated softly. "Yes, that has been your focus for quite some time, has it not, Victor? Making sure this merger happens no matter what." Something in Richard's tone made Victor's confident expression falter slightly. "The merger is important for Velocity Innovations' future. You know that as well as I do I?" Richard pulled out his own folder from his briefcase. "Because I have spent this morning looking at financial records too, Victor. Very detailed records. Would you like to know what I discovered?" Victor's jaw tightened. "I am sure whatever you found can be explained during the audit." "Oh, I am sure it can be explained," Richard agreed. "For instance, I can explain that these shell companies you mentioned were not actually created by me. The signatures on these incorporation documents are forgeries, excellent forgeries. I will grant you that. Someone who had access to thousands of my authentic signatures over the years could certainly learn to replicate my handwriting quite convincingly. The room had gone very quiet. Board member Thomas Chen frowned. "Richard, what are you saying?" "I am saying that for the past 15 years, someone has been systematically stealing from Velocity Innovations. That someone created an elaborate network of fake companies, forged my signature on countless documents, and diverted over $40 million into offshore accounts. And that same someone has now attempted to frame me for his crimes, so that he could complete this merger and walk away clean." Victor's face had gone from red to pale. "That is ridiculous. Richard, you cannot possibly expect anyone to believe I have proof," Richard interrupted, his voice hard as steel. "Financial records that show the real pattern of these thefts, testimony from former employees who questioned suspicious transactions, and most damningly, I have evidence that 5 years ago, when an honest accountant named Nathan Bennett discovered what was happening, that accountant died under mysterious circumstances just before he could reveal the truth." Claire stood up from her seat along the wall, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Nathan Bennett was my father, and Victor Hartwell murdered him to keep his crimes hidden." The arrest Victor's composure finally shattered. "This is insane. You are both delusional." He spun toward the board members. "Can you not see what is happening here? Richard knows he has been caught, so he is trying to turn this around on me. Do not let him manipulate you." The conference room door opened and Detective Morrison entered, followed by 4 uniformed officers. "Victor Hartwell, I am placing you under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and suspicion of murder in the death of Nathan Bennett. You have the right to remain silent, no?" Victor shouted, backing away from the advancing officers. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. "You do not understand. I built this company too. I worked just as hard as Richard, but he got all the credit, all the recognition. His name on the building, his face in the magazines. I was just the numbers guy, always in his shadow." "So you stole from him," Morrison said calmly, nodding to his officers to move in. "You stole millions. And when someone discovered your crimes, you killed him." "I did not kill Nathan." Victor's voice cracked. "That was not supposed to happen. I just wanted to scare him, make him understand that some secrets are better left buried." But he would not listen. He kept digging, kept threatening to expose everything. So Victor stopped abruptly, realizing he had said too much. The officers reached him and began placing handcuffs on his wrists. He looked at Richard with an expression of pure hatred mixed with something that might have been regret. "We could have ruled this industry together," Victor said bitterly. "But you were never satisfied with what we had. Always pushing for more growth, more innovation, more recognition. You made me invisible, Richard. I was just returning the favor." "You killed an innocent man," Richard replied, his voice hollow. "You stole from people who trusted you. And you tried to destroy me to cover your crimes. Whatever justifications you tell yourself, Victor, none of that makes you a victim. It makes you a criminal." As the officers led Victor out of the conference room, the remaining board members sat in stunned silence. Patricia Nguyen finally spoke, her voice shaky. "Richard, we owe you an apology. If we had listened to Victor's accusations, if we had moved forward with removing you, you would have been doing exactly what Victor wanted," Richard finished. "He counted on your trust, just as I did. The difference is that he exploited it while I tried to earn it." Rebuilding and healing, the next several hours passed in a blur of police interviews, legal consultations, and crisis management. The merger with Titanium Systems was immediately canceled once the full scope of Victor's fraud became apparent. The company's stock price took a hit when news of the embezzlement broke, but Richard's immediate transparency and cooperation with authorities helped minimize the damage. 3 days later, Richard sat in his office late in the evening, reviewing the preliminary reports from the forensic accountants who were untangling the web of Victor's crimes. The work would take months, possibly years, to complete fully. But already they had recovered over $30 million in stolen assets and identified the locations of additional hidden accounts. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Claire entered, looking exhausted but satisfied. "The last of the police statements are complete. Detective Morrison says we should hear about additional charges within the week. They are also reopening the investigation into my father's death with new evidence. Richard gestured for her to sit. How are you holding up? This cannot have been easy for you. Claire settled into the chair across from his desk. It has been 5 years of carrying this weight, wondering if I would ever see justice for my father. Now that it is finally happening, I feel strange. Relieved, yes, but also empty in a way. My father is still gone. Nothing we do will bring him back, no, Richard agreed softly. But we can honor his memory by making sure his discovery was not in vain. Your father tried to protect this company and its employees. We are going to make sure that protection continues. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk to Claire. I have been thinking about the future of Velocity Innovations. We need to rebuild trust with our employees, our investors, our customers. We need systems in place that ensure this kind of fraud can never happen again. And we need someone to lead that effort. Someone who understands the importance of integrity and is not afraid to speak truth to power. Claire opened the folder and her eyes widened as she read the job offer inside. Director of Corporate Integrity and Ethics? Richard, I am not qualified for this. I coordinate hotel events. I do not have an MBA or years of corporate experience. You have something more valuable, Richard countered. You have courage. You risked everything to do what was right, even when you had no guarantee anyone would believe you. You spent 5 years teaching yourself financial forensics and building a case that brought down a sophisticated criminal. Those are exactly the qualities I need in someone overseeing corporate integrity. Claire looked up from the document, her eyes glistening. My father would have loved this. He always said that honest work mattered more than prestigious titles. Your father was a wise man. I wish I had known him better. I wish I had listened when he tried to reach me. Richard's voice grew thick with emotion. I cannot change the past, Claire. But I can try to build a better future. Will you help me do that? Claire wiped away a tear and smiled. Yes, I will help you. But on one condition. Name it. We establish a scholarship fund in my father's name. For students studying accounting and business ethics, people who want to do honest work in a world that does not always reward honesty. Richard stood and extended his hand. Consider it done. The Nathan Bennett Memorial Scholarship for Excellence in Business Ethics. We will fund it generously. As they shook hands, Richard felt something shift inside him. For 27 years, he had built Velocity Innovations alongside someone he thought was his closest friend. That betrayal had cut deeper than any business loss could. But from the ashes of that friendship, something new was emerging. A connection based, not on shared history or mutual benefit, but on shared values and mutual respect. A new chapter begins 6 months later. Richard stood before a room full of journalists and industry analysts at Velocity Innovations' annual shareholder meeting. The past half year had been turbulent. Victor's trial was ongoing. The company had undergone massive restructuring and competitors had tried to exploit the chaos. But somehow, Velocity Innovations had not just survived, it had begun to thrive in new ways. Today marks a new chapter for our company, Richard announced, his voice strong and clear. We have faced our failures honestly, reformed our practices completely, and committed ourselves to a standard of transparency that goes beyond industry norms. Every financial transaction, every vendor contract, every executive decision will be subject to oversight by our new corporate integrity division. He gestured to Claire, who sat in the front row wearing a professional suit and an expression of quiet confidence. Under the leadership of Director Claire Bennett, we have implemented systems that make fraud virtually impossible and whistleblowing not just protected but encouraged. We have partnered with universities to develop ethics training programs. And we have established the Nathan Bennett Memorial Scholarship to support the next generation of business leaders who believe that success and integrity are not opposing forces. The room erupted in applause. Richard noticed several journalists nodding approvingly as they took notes. The story of how a hotel event coordinator had single-handedly exposed a massive fraud had captured public imagination, and Claire had become something of an unexpected hero in business media. After the presentation, as the crowd dispersed and journalists conducted interviews, Richard found himself standing by the window of the conference room, looking out at the Chicago skyline. He thought about that morning 6 months ago, when a stranger had stepped into his path and changed everything. Claire joined him at the window. "Nervous about the trial?" she asked. Victor's case was set to go before a jury in 2 weeks. "Not nervous," Richard said thoughtfully. "More reflective, I suppose. I keep wondering how I missed the signs for so long. Victor was stealing from me for 15 years, and I never suspected." "He was your friend," Claire said simply. "We do not want to believe the worst about people we trust." "That is not a weakness, Richard. That is part of being human." "Perhaps, but I am learning that trust must be earned continuously, not granted blindly, based on history. Your father understood that. He saw something wrong and refused to ignore it, even when it cost him everything." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Claire spoke again. "I've been thinking about something you said 6 months ago, about building a better future. I think we are doing that, but not just for the company. You have changed too." Richard raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "The Richard Sterling I researched before approaching you that day was brilliant, but distant. All business, all the time. The Richard Sterling I work with now asks employees about their families, stays late to mentor junior staff, and actually takes weekends off." "You have become more human," Richard smiled. "I suppose nearly losing everything has a way of clarifying priorities. I spent so long focused on building an empire that I forgot why I was building it in the first place. Success means nothing if it is built on lies and costs us our humanity." His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morrison. "Jury selection complete. Trial starts Monday. Prosecution feels confident about conviction on all counts." Richard showed the message to Claire. She read it and nodded slowly. "Good. My father will finally have justice." "He already has something better," Richard said. "He has a daughter who honored his legacy by finishing what he started. He has a scholarship that will help others follow his example. And he has the knowledge that his final investigation, even though it cost him his life, ultimately protected countless people from continued fraud." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Thank you for saying that. And thank you for taking a chance on a stranger in a hotel lobby who had an insane story about corporate conspiracies." "Thank you for having the courage to tell that story," Richard replied. "You saved my company, Claire. But more importantly, you reminded me what really matters. Not the quarterly earnings or the stock price or the industry rankings, the integrity with which we do our work and the positive impact we have on people's lives." They walked together out of the conference room. Richard felt genuinely hopeful about the future for the first time in months. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more revelations from Victor's trial, more challenges as they rebuilt trust, more difficult decisions about how to balance growth with ethics. But Richard was no longer facing those challenges alone. He had Claire, whose moral compass never wavered. He had Margaret, who had come out of retirement to help restructure the financial oversight systems. He had a board of directors who now understood the importance of vigilance. And most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the most valuable assets in business are not patents or market share, but rather honesty, courage, and the willingness to listen when someone tries to warn you about danger. The verdict: the trial of Victor. Hartwell lasted 3 weeks and dominated business news coverage. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. The case for murder was more circumstantial, relying on the suspicious timing of Nathan Bennett's death, the traces of heart attack-inducing substances found in the independent autopsy, and Victor's own partial confession during his arrest. Richard attended every day of the trial. Sitting in the gallery beside Claire, watching his former friend testify, making excuses, and attempting to justify his actions, Richard felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger, certainly. Betrayal, absolutely. But also a strange kind of sadness for the man Victor had become, or perhaps had always been underneath the facade of friendship. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with journalists, Velocity, Innovation, employees, and curious observers who had followed the case. On the charge of embezzlement in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty on the charge of fraud, how do you find? Guilty. The verdicts continued, guilty on every count related to the financial crimes. But when they reached the murder charge, there was a tense pause. On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Nathan Bennett, how do you find? The jury foreman looked directly at Victor as he spoke. Guilty. Claire let out a sob and buried her face in her hands. Richard put his arm around her shoulders as the courtroom erupted in murmurs and the judge called for order. Victor sat motionless at the defense table, his face blank with shock. At sentencing 3 weeks later, Victor received 35 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 20. It was effectively a life sentence for a man in his 50s. As Richard and Claire left the courthouse after the sentencing, they were met by a crowd of reporters shouting questions. Richard raised his hand for quiet. Today justice was served, he said simply. Not just for Velocity Innovations, but for Nathan Bennett and his family. Mr. Bennett was an honest man who tried to do the right thing. He paid the ultimate price for that integrity. We will honor his memory by ensuring that at Velocity Innovations, doing the right thing is always rewarded, never punished. Thank you. 5 years later, Richard Sterling stood in the lobby of Velocity Innovations' newly expanded headquarters, admiring the bronze plaque that had been installed that morning. It read, "The Nathan Bennett Center for Business Ethics, dedicated to the memory of an honest man who chose integrity over safety, established 2024. The center occupied an entire floor of the building and served as both a training facility for Velocity employees and a resource for other companies. Seeking to improve their ethical practices, it had become a model that business schools across the country studied and tried to replicate." "It looks perfect," Claire said, coming to stand beside him. In 5 years, she had transformed from a hotel event coordinator to one of the most respected voices in corporate ethics. She had spoken at conferences, written articles for business journals, and helped dozens of companies establish their own integrity programs. But she had never forgotten where it all started. "Your father would be proud," Richard said. "Not just of this, but of you. Of everything you have accomplished." Claire smiled, resting her head briefly on Richard's shoulder in a gesture that had become natural over the years of working together. Their relationship had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. Not quite father and daughter, not merely boss and employee, but something more profound. They were partners in a mission to prove that business success and ethical behavior were not mutually exclusive. "I have been thinking," Claire said, as they walked toward the elevators, "about that day in the hotel lobby, about how easily you could have ignored me and gone to that meeting, about how differently everything might have turned out if you had not listened." "I think about that too," Richard admitted. "I almost did not listen. I was so focused on the merger, so certain I knew exactly how my life was supposed to unfold. Your warning disrupted everything I thought I knew. And that disruption saved you." "It saved me in ways beyond just the business," Richard said. "I was successful before, but I was not fulfilled. I had built an empire, but I had lost sight of why it mattered. You helped me remember that success without integrity is just another form of failure." They reached Richard's office, but before entering, Claire turned to face him. "I never properly thanked you, for believing me that day, for trusting a stranger with an impossible story, for helping me find justice for my father." "You trusted me first," Richard pointed out. "You spent 5 years preparing to confront Victor, putting yourself at risk to uncover the truth. You could have walked away, protected yourself, let someone else fight this battle, but you did not. Because some things are worth fighting for," Claire said simply. "Integrity, justice, truth. My father taught me that. And you have spent the last 5 years proving that those values can thrive even in the business world." Richard smiled, feeling a contentment that had eluded him for most of his life. "We've proved it together, and we will keep proving it, one decision at a time. One ethical choice at a time, one person at a time," as they entered his office to begin another day of work. Richard glanced back at the bronze plaque visible through the glass walls. Nathan Bennett's legacy lived on, not as a cautionary tale of a whistleblower who paid the ultimate price, but as an inspiration for a new way of conducting business, sometimes. Richard reflected, "The most important meetings are the ones we never attend. And sometimes, the most valuable warnings come from strangers." who care enough to speak truth in the face of power. That morning in the hotel lobby had changed everything. It had cost Richard a friend he thought he knew, but it had gained him something far more valuable, a sense of purpose that transcended profit margins and stock prices. It had shown him that success built on lies is worthless, but integrity defended against all odds is priceless. And it had taught him that sometimes the person who saves you is not the one you expect, but exactly the one you need.